Hey there. Tonight we find ourselves behind the visor of a medieval knight, not in shining glory, but in a 50-pound metal coffin. We're hallucinating from poisoned bread and trying not to die in a mud-soaked tournament pit. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and tell me what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. Let's get something straight. No one in the Middle Ages rolled out of bed thinking, you know what, I'd like to spend my life squeezed into a metal coffin, collecting taxes from starving peasants. For a psychopathic lord who thinks bathing causes disease, becoming a knight had nothing to do with glory, honor, or epic quests. It was about being a professional thug in expensive armor. The job description included a life expectancy that made plague victims look optimistic. Mobility was severely compromised. Despite what modern demonstrations suggest, yes, a properly fitted suit of armor allowed some movement, but some movement isn't adequate when people are trying to kill you. You couldn't run effectively. You couldn't climb easily. You couldn't fight for extended periods without exhausting yourself. Most armored combat lasted only a few minutes, then fighters collapsed from fatigue. Getting into armor required assistance from squires or servants. You couldn't put on a full suit by yourself. This meant you were helplessly dependent on other people for basic functions, like dressing and undressing. If your squire was killed, wounded, or simply unavailable, you might be stuck in your armor until someone helped you out of it. Knights sometimes died because they couldn't remove their armor quickly enough. When circumstances changed, bathroom functions became logistical nightmares. Full armor didn't include convenient access panels for natural bodily functions. Knights either had to be partially undressed by their squires, or soil themselves, or try to hold it until they could get help removing armor pieces. Many knights developed bladder and bowel problems from trying to control bodily functions while armored. Eating and drinking were nearly impossible while fully armored. Helmets had to be removed or lifted to allow access to your mouth. This meant exposing your head to enemy weapons during meals. Many knights went hours without food or water during combat situations, leading to dehydration, malnutrition, and poor performance. When they most needed to be alert and strong, armor maintenance was a full-time job. It consumed enormous amounts of time and money. Metal rusted constantly, especially in damp conditions. Joints required regular oiling and adjustment. Dents had to be hammered out, or they would interfere with movement. A single suit of armor required daily maintenance by skilled craftsmen, and even then it deteriorated rapidly under combat conditions. The cost was astronomical. A complete suit of quality armor cost more than most peasant families earned in several lifetimes. Knights often went into debt to purchase armor, then spent the rest of their careers trying to pay for it. Many knights wore inferior armor because they couldn't afford better, which meant they died from cost-cutting measures in protective equipment. Repairs after combat were expensive and time-consuming. Every dent, scratch, and puncture had to be professionally repaired, or the armor became less effective. Knights who couldn't afford proper repairs wore increasingly damaged armor. That provided decreasing protection. Some knights died because their armor had been weakened by previous damage that they couldn't afford to fix. The psychological effects were severe. Being encased in metal created claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, and social isolation. Knights couldn't communicate normally with their faces covered and their voices muffled. They couldn't touch anything directly or feel environmental conditions through their metal shell. Many knights developed anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems from spending too much time isolated inside their armor. And the final insult? Most weapons could penetrate armor anyway. Crossbow bolts could punch through plate mail at close range. Warhammers could crush armor, and the person inside it. Poleaxes could cut through metal like it was leather. The armor that knights died trying to afford and maintain often failed to protect them when they needed it most, leaving them slow, exhausted, and vulnerable to weapons specifically designed to defeat their expensive protection. If the armor and weapons didn't kill you, medieval medicine would gladly complete the job. Medical care for wounded knights was based on a combination of ignorance and superstition. and treatments that were often more lethal than the injuries they were supposed to cure. Battlefield medicine consisted of whatever the army's barber surgeon could remember from watching other people die. These weren't trained doctors, they were craftsmen who cut hair and pulled teeth. When they weren't experimenting on wounded soldiers, most barber surgeons had no formal medical training, no understanding of anatomy, and no concept of sanitation. Their medical knowledge consisted of folk remedies, religious beliefs, and techniques passed down through generations of trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. Wound treatment was guaranteed to cause infection. Open injuries were packed with whatever materials were available: moss, animal dung, spider webs, or crushed insects. The theory was that these substances would stop bleeding and promote healing. In reality, they introduced bacteria, parasites, and toxic compounds directly into open wounds. Most knights who survived initial injuries died from infections that developed during treatment. Amputation was the preferred solution for any serious injury to arms or legs. Medieval surgeons believed that removing damaged limbs prevented infections from spreading to the rest of the body. Amputations were performed with saws, knives, and axes that had been used for other purposes and were rarely cleaned between patients. Anesthesia consisted of strong alcohol, opium when available, or simply hitting the patient over the head until they lost consciousness. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost every medical condition. Medieval doctors believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, and that draining blood would restore proper balance. Knights suffering from fever, infection, or weakness were systematically drained of the blood they needed to fight their conditions. Many patients died from blood loss, rather than their original injuries or illnesses. Surgery was performed without understanding of anatomy, circulation, or basic physiological processes. Surgeons opened body cavities without knowing what they would find inside, or how to repair damage. Surgical instruments were crude, unsterilized, and often improvised from household tools. Most surgical patients died from the procedure itself, from infections that developed afterward, or from complications that surgeons couldn't anticipate or treat. Pain management was primitive and dangerous. Opium and alcohol were the only effective painkillers available, but both carried risks of addiction, overdose, and adverse interactions with other treatments. Many patients became addicted to pain medications and died from overdoses or withdrawal symptoms. Others suffered through procedures without any pain relief at all, because medications weren't available, or were considered too dangerous to use. Herbal remedies were based on folklore and superstition, rather than medical knowledge. Knights were treated with plant extracts, animal parts, and mineral compounds that had no therapeutic value, and often caused additional health problems. Some herbal treatments were actively poisonous, killing patients faster than their original conditions. Others simply delayed effective treatment until it was too late to help. Dental care was limited to extraction with crude pliers or knives. Knights with tooth problems faced the choice between agonizing pain and potentially lethal surgery. Dental infections were common and often led to blood poisoning, brain abscesses, and death. Many knights died from dental problems that could be easily treated today with antibiotics and proper surgical techniques. Mental health treatment was non-existent. Knights suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, depression, or other psychological conditions were beaten, restrained, or subjected to religious exorcism. There was no understanding of mental illness, no treatment for psychological problems, and no support for knights who couldn't cope with the violence and stress of their profession. Rehabilitation after injuries was impossible. Knights who survived wounds often faced permanent disabilities that ended their military careers and left them unable to support themselves. There were no physical therapy programs, no adaptive equipment, and no social support systems for disabled knights. Many became beggars, outlaws, or simply died from neglect. After their military usefulness ended, preventive medicine was completely absent. Knights had no understanding of disease prevention, nutritional requirements, or basic hygiene practices that could have prevented many health problems. They ate contaminated food, drank polluted water, and lived in conditions that guaranteed exposure to infectious diseases. The medical profession was unregulated, and unaccountable. Anyone could claim to be a doctor, surgeon, or healer without training, certification, or oversight. Many knights were treated by charlatans, frauds, and well-meaning but incompetent practitioners who caused more harm than good. There was no way to distinguish between legitimate medical providers and dangerous quacks. Medical costs consumed whatever wealth knights managed to accumulate. Effective treatments, when they existed, were expensive and available only to the wealthy. Most knights received whatever medical care they could afford, which was usually inadequate and often harmful. Many knights died because they couldn't pay for proper treatment, not because proper treatment didn't exist. The final irony was that knights often had access to some of the best medical knowledge of their time. When they captured enemy physicians or occupied territories with established medical traditions, but they usually killed or ignored these medical professionals because foreign medicine was viewed with suspicion, and knights preferred familiar treatments that were killing them to unfamiliar treatments that might have saved their lives. The romantic notion of knights as protectors of the innocent is pure fantasy. Your actual job description was much simpler. Use violence and intimidation to extract wealth from peasants. For your feudal superior, you were an armed tax collector, land grabber, and enforcement officer for a protection racket. That made modern organized crime look ethical. Tax collection was your primary responsibility, and it involved riding into villages with armed men to demand money, food, livestock, and labor from people who were already starving. Medieval taxation wasn't based on ability to pay or fair assessment of resources. It was based on how much wealth could be extracted through threats of violence. Knights who failed to collect sufficient taxes faced punishment from their lords, so they had strong incentives to use whatever force was necessary to meet their quotas. Land seizure was a regular part of knightly duties. When peasants couldn't pay their taxes, knights would confiscate their property, evict their families, and redistribute their holdings to people who could provide better financial returns. Knights participated in the systematic theft of property from people who had worked the same land for generations, using legal technicalities and military force to justify actions that were essentially armed robbery. Peasant intimidation was a daily activity, designed to maintain the social order that kept knights in positions of authority. Knights would ride through territories making shows of force, demonstrating their weapons and armor, and reminding local populations that resistance would be met with violence. These intimidation campaigns were designed to prevent organized opposition to feudal authority and to discourage individual acts of rebellion. Military raids on neighboring territories were opportunities to steal wealth, capture slaves, and expand your lord's holdings through organized violence. Knights participated in attacks on villages, farms, and small towns, for the specific purpose of looting whatever valuable could be carried away and destroying whatever couldn't be stolen. These raids were officially called military campaigns, but they were actually criminal enterprises, conducted under the protection of feudal law. Slave trading was a significant source of income for knights who captured prisoners during raids or military campaigns. Captured peasants, enemy soldiers, and civilian populations were sold as slaves to whoever would pay the highest prices. Knights participated in human trafficking operations that separated families, destroyed communities, and condemned innocent people to lives of forced labor. Protection rackets were unofficial but widespread activities, where knights demanded payment from merchants, travelers, and local businesses in exchange for safe passage through territories under their control. Knights who were supposed to provide security often created the dangers they were paid to prevent, robbing anyone who didn't pay for protection, and attacking anyone who tried to travel without knightly escorts. Judicial corruption was endemic, because knights often served as judges, investigators, and enforcers for legal systems that they could manipulate for personal gain. Knights could declare people guilty of crimes that justified confiscating their property, could determine punishments that benefited knightly interests, and could selectively enforce laws that served their financial and political purposes. Debt enforcement involved using violence and intimidation to collect money owed to lords, merchants, and other members of the feudal hierarchy. Knights would seize property, imprison debtors, and threaten family members to force payment of debts that were often based on fraudulent contracts or illegal interest charges. Many knights specialized in debt collection because it provided steady income and opportunities for personal enrichment. Marriage negotiations were essentially business transactions, where knights arranged marriages for political and economic advantage. Rather than personal compatibility, knights bought and sold women like livestock, using marriage contracts to acquire property, forge political alliances, and gain control over resources that they couldn't obtain through direct conquest. Religious persecution was officially sanctioned. When knights participated in campaigns against heretics, non-Christians, and anyone whose religious beliefs threatened the established order, knights burned churches, destroyed religious texts, and killed religious leaders who represented alternative sources of authority that might challenge feudal control. Religious wars provided cover for looting, land grabbing, and settling personal disputes through violence. The protection of trade routes that knights claimed to provide was actually a monopolization of commerce that allowed them to control prices, restrict competition, and extract tribute from merchants who needed access to markets. Knights didn't protect trade, they controlled it for their own benefit, creating artificial scarcities and manipulating commercial relationships to maximize their profits. Recruitment of soldiers was often accomplished through forced conscription, where knights would enter villages and demand that young men join military campaigns, whether they wanted to or not. Knights kidnapped peasant sons, threatened families who tried to hide their children, and used military service as a form of taxation that removed productive workers from communities that needed their labor. The enforcement of feudal contracts involved using violence to ensure that peasants fulfilled their obligations to provide labor, crops, and military service to their lords. Knights monitored peasant productivity, punished workers who didn't meet quotas, and used the threat of violence to extract maximum effort from people who received minimal compensation for their work. And when knights weren't actively engaged in these criminal activities, they were training to become better at them. Knightly education focused on developing skills in violence, intimidation, and exploitation. Rather than leadership, justice, or service to others, the entire knight training system was designed to produce professional criminals who could use military skills to generate wealth through theft, extortion, and organized violence. Medieval knights didn't dine on the elaborate feasts portrayed in movies and television. Their diet was a collection of nutritional disasters that caused chronic health problems, shortened lifespans, and contributed to the high mortality rates that made knighthood such a brief career. Bread was your dietary staple, and medieval bread was nothing like modern bread. It was made from whatever grains were available, often including barley, oats, and rye, that had been contaminated with ergot fungus. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Knights regularly consumed bread that was literally poisonous, causing mental illness and physical deterioration that they attributed to other causes. Meat was preserved with salt levels that would be considered toxic today. Salt pork, salt beef, and salt fish contained so much sodium that they caused high blood pressure, kidney disease, and heart problems. The preservation process also created chemical compounds that were carcinogenic and neurotoxic. Knights ate meat that was actively damaging their health. With every meal, vegetables were rarely fresh, and often contaminated with human waste that was used as fertilizer. Medieval agriculture used raw sewage to improve soil fertility, which meant that crops were infected with bacteria, parasites, and diseases that caused dysentery, cholera, and other intestinal problems. Knights ate vegetables that guaranteed digestive problems and shortened lifespans. Water was contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and chemical pollutants from metalworking, leather tanning, and other industrial activities that used streams and rivers as waste disposal systems. Knights drank water that contained heavy metals, organic toxins, and infectious organisms that caused poisoning, disease, and neurological damage. Beer and wine were safer than water, because the alcohol content killed some bacteria But medieval alcoholic beverages were often contaminated with lead from storage containers and processing equipment. Lead poisoning caused mental deterioration, physical weakness, and premature death. Knights who avoided waterborne diseases by drinking alcohol instead were slowly poisoning themselves with heavy metals. Dairy products were unpasteurized and frequently contaminated with bacteria that caused tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other diseases that could be transmitted from animals to humans. Knights consumed milk, cheese, and butter that carried infectious diseases from the cattle, sheep, and goats that produced them. Spices were used to mask the taste of spoiled food, rather than to enhance fresh ingredients. Knights ate rotten meat that had been disguised with pepper, cinnamon, and other expensive seasonings. The spices didn't eliminate the bacteria and toxins in spoiled food, they just made it possible to eat contaminated ingredients without immediately vomiting. Honey was the only available sweetener, but medieval honey was often contaminated with pollen from toxic plants, creating a sweet poison that caused gradual health deterioration. Some types of honey contained compounds that were hallucinogenic or neurotoxic, causing mental problems that knights couldn't identify or treat. Food storage methods guaranteed spoilage and contamination. Knights stored food in containers that harbored bacteria, in environments that promoted rot, and for periods that allowed dangerous microorganisms to multiply. Most food consumed by knights was partially spoiled, nutritionally depleted, and contaminated with harmful substances. Cooking methods were designed to make spoiled food edible, rather than to preserve nutrition or enhance flavor. Knights boiled, roasted, and stewed ingredients until they had eliminated most vitamins and minerals, while concentrating toxins and preservatives. Medieval cooking techniques destroyed whatever nutritional value might have existed in raw ingredients. Nutritional deficiencies were universal among knights because their diet lacked essential vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients required for health. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and poor wound healing. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency caused bone deformities and fractures. Anemia from iron deficiency caused weakness and reduced physical performance. Eating schedules were irregular and often involved consuming large quantities of food during feasts, followed by extended periods of fasting. Knights alternated between overeating and starvation, creating metabolic problems that contributed to diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic conditions. Their bodies never adapted to consistent nutrition levels. Food quality varied dramatically, based on social status and economic conditions. Knights ate better food than peasants, but worse food than nobility, which meant they consumed ingredients that were too expensive to waste, but too low quality to be nutritious. They occupied a dietary middle ground that combined the worst aspects of both peasant and noble eating habits. Medieval war horses weren't the magnificent creatures portrayed in romantic literature. They were expensive, high-maintenance animals that died so frequently that knights spent more time walking than riding, and most knights' careers ended when they couldn't afford to replace their dead mounts. Destriers, the heavy war horses used by knights, cost more than most people earned in several years. A single quality war horse could cost as much as a small village, making horse ownership a constant financial burden that drove many knights into debt. Knights often mortgaged their land, borrowed money at ruinous interest rates, or committed crimes to afford horses that were essential for their military effectiveness. Horse mortality rates were astronomical because war horses were bred for size and strength, rather than health and longevity. Heavy war horses were prone to genetic defects, joint problems, and cardiovascular diseases that shortened their lifespans dramatically. Many war horses died before reaching full maturity, leaving knights with enormous debts for animals that provided no return on investment. Battle injuries killed horses faster than knights because horses were larger targets that couldn't wear protective armor effectively. Horse armor existed but was expensive, heavy, and provided limited protection against weapons specifically designed to kill horses. Knights watched their expensive mounts die from arrow wounds, spear thrusts, and sword cuts. while they were still trying to pay for them. Disease outbreaks could destroy entire cavalry units by killing all their horses simultaneously. Equine influenza, strangles, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through horse populations that were housed together in unsanitary conditions. Knights who survived battles often found themselves stranded when disease killed their transportation. Feeding war horses required enormous quantities of high-quality grain and hay that were expensive and difficult to transport during military campaigns. A single war horse consumed more food than several human beings, creating logistical challenges that made cavalry operations prohibitively expensive for extended periods. Many military campaigns failed because armies couldn't afford to feed their horses. Training war horses was a specialized skill that required years of work and significant financial investment. War horses had to be trained to charge into combat, tolerate loud noises, and respond to commands, while surrounded by violence and chaos. The training process was expensive, time-consuming, and often unsuccessful, leaving knights with expensive animals that were unsuitable for combat. Horse maintenance required constant veterinary care that was expensive and often ineffective. Medieval horse medicine was as primitive as human medicine, consisting mostly of folk remedies, superstition, and treatments that caused more harm than good. Knights paid veterinarians to treat their horses, with procedures that often killed the animals they were supposed to heal. Breeding war horses was an expensive gamble that rarely produced animals suitable for combat. Medieval breeding programs had no understanding of genetics, heredity, or selective breeding principles. Knights invested in breeding operations that produced offspring with genetic defects, poor temperament, or inadequate physical characteristics for military use. Transportation of horses during military campaigns created additional expenses and logistical challenges. Horses required special transportation, frequent rest stops, and veterinary care during travel. Many horses died from stress, injury, or disease during military movements, leaving knights stranded in enemy territory without transportation or means of escape. Theft of horses was common because they were valuable and difficult to protect. Knights faced constant threats from horse thieves, enemy raiders, and opportunistic criminals who stole horses whenever surveillance was inadequate. Many knights lost their mounts to theft and couldn't afford replacements, ending their military careers through property crime rather than combat casualties. Alternative transportation was inadequate for knightly combat. Knights who couldn't afford war horses could use regular horses, but these animals were unsuitable for heavy cavalry charges and often died from stress when used in combat situations. Knights mounted on inferior horses were easy targets for enemies who could outmaneuver and overpower them. Insurance for horses was non-existent, meaning that knights bore the full financial risk of horse ownership without any protection against loss when horses died, were stolen, or became unsuitable for combat. Knights absorbed the entire financial loss and had to find money for replacements or abandon their military careers. Social status was tied to horse quality, creating pressure for knights to own expensive animals that they couldn't afford. Knights with inferior horses were viewed as unsuccessful and were excluded from military units, social events, and political opportunities. The pressure to maintain appropriate horses drove many knights into debt and criminal activity. The final irony was that many knights died trying to save their horses because they couldn't afford replacements. Knights who should have retreated from dangerous situations instead stayed to protect their mounts, often dying in the process. The animals that were supposed to improve knights' survival instead created financial pressures that led to poor tactical decisions and unnecessary deaths. Most knights ended their careers not through glorious combat deaths, but through the mundane reality of horse mortality, when their mounts died and they couldn't afford replacements. Knights became foot soldiers, mercenaries, or outlaw. The romantic image of knights on horseback lasted only as long as they could afford to replace the animals that died faster than their riders. Medieval combat wasn't the elegant sword fighting you see in films. It was a brief, brutal, and usually fatal encounter, where technical skill mattered less than luck. and most participants died from infections, blood loss, or simple exhaustion. Rather than dramatic sword wounds, battles lasted minutes, not hours. Real combat was so physically demanding that even trained warriors could only fight at full intensity for a few minutes before collapsing from exhaustion. Medieval armor was heavy, weapons were heavier, and the adrenaline rush of mortal combat burned through human energy reserves faster than any other physical activity. Most battles were decided by who collapsed first, rather than who displayed superior skill. Hand-to-hand combat was crude, desperate, and personal. Knights didn't engage in elegant swordplay. They used whatever techniques worked fastest to disable their opponents. This included eye gouging, biting, wrestling, and using daggers to stab through armor joints. Medieval combat manuals taught techniques for breaking fingers, crushing testicles, and using helmets as weapons. Honor was a luxury for people who weren't about to die. Weapons were designed to cause maximum damage in minimum time. Medieval swords weren't graceful fencing weapons. They were heavy cutting tools, designed to hack through armor, bone, and flesh. Warhammers could crush skulls inside helmets. Maces could break bones through armor. Poleaxes could cut through both armor and the person wearing it. Every weapon was an instrument of mutilation, rather than precision. Archery was the most effective way to kill knights, and archers were specifically trained to target knights, because they were high-value targets. Longbow arrows could penetrate armor at close range. Crossbow bolts could punch through plate mail like paper, and massed archery could kill entire cavalry units before they reached their targets. Knights charged into clouds of arrows that were specifically designed to kill them. Siege warfare was particularly brutal, because it combined the horrors of combat with the additional miseries of starvation, disease, and psychological warfare. Sieges lasted months or years, during which time knights were trapped in castles or cities, where food ran out, water became contaminated, and disease killed more people than enemy weapons. Knights often died from eating leather, drinking contaminated water, or simply giving up hope. Cavalry charges were suicide missions, disguised as tactical maneuvers. Knights rode heavy horses at full speed toward enemy formations that were specifically designed to kill horses and riders. Most cavalry charges failed because horses were killed by spears, arrows, or obstacles before reaching their targets. Knights who survived the initial charge often found themselves surrounded by enemies and unable to retreat. Infantry combat was even worse, because dismounted knights had to fight on foot, while wearing armor that was designed for mounted combat. Foot combat involved close-quarters fighting, where knights could be overwhelmed by multiple opponents, knocked down and trampled, or simply exhausted to death by the weight of their armor. Many knights died because they fell down and couldn't get back up. Wounds were almost always fatal, because of infection, blood loss, or damage to vital organs that couldn't be repaired. A minor cut could become infected and kill you weeks later. A broken bone could heal incorrectly and leave you permanently disabled. Internal injuries from blunt trauma could cause slow death from organ failure. Knights rarely died instantly. They usually died slowly from complications. Battlefield medicine was non-existent during actual combat. Wounded knights received no medical attention until after battles ended, by which time many had bled to death, gone into shock, or developed complications that made treatment impossible. Knights fought while wounded, which worsened their injuries and reduced their chances of survival. Many knights died because they couldn't stop fighting long enough to treat their wounds. Prisoner capture was often worse than death, because prisoners could be tortured, ransomed, or enslaved. Knights who surrendered faced interrogation, humiliation, and financial ruin, as their families paid enormous ransoms for their release. Some prisoners were held for years while ransom negotiations continued. Others were tortured for information about enemy plans, fortifications, or troop movement. Weather conditions affected combat outcomes more than skill or equipment. Rain made armor slippery and dangerous. Snow created visibility problems and footing hazards. Heat caused knights to collapse from exhaustion. Inside their metal armor, cold weather made weapons brittle and armor joints stiff. Many battles were decided by weather rather than military prowess. Friendly fire casualties were common, because combat situations were chaotic and identification was difficult. Knights wearing similar armor and fighting in close quarters often killed their own allies by mistake. Archers shot at any armored figure within range, assuming they were enemies. Infantry attacked any mounted warrior, whether friend or foe. Many knights died from wounds inflicted by their own forces. Retreat was often impossible, because heavy armor and exhausted horses made rapid movement difficult. Knights who tried to flee from losing battles were easy targets for pursuit forces who could move faster than heavily armored cavalry. Many knights died during retreats because they couldn't escape quickly enough to avoid capture or death. The psychological trauma of combat created mental health problems that ended military careers. As effectively as physical wounds, knights who survived battles often suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But medieval society had no understanding of psychological warfare or treatment for combat trauma. Many knights became unable to fight effectively because they couldn't cope with the mental demands of repeated exposure to violence and death. Combat experience created a cycle of violence that made knights unsuitable for civilian life. Knights who survived multiple battles became addicted to violence, unable to resolve conflicts peacefully, and prone to using force to solve problems that could be handled through negotiation. The skills that kept knights alive in combat made them dangerous and unwelcome in peaceful communities. Being a knight wasn't just dangerous, it was financially ruinous. The costs of knightly equipment, training, and lifestyle far exceeded the income that most knights could generate through legitimate means, creating economic pressures that drove them into debt, crime, and early graves. Equipment costs were astronomical and constantly increasing. A complete set of knightly equipment, armor, weapons, horse, and accessories, cost more than most people earned in their entire lifetimes. Knights had to purchase not just their initial equipment, but also replacements for items that were damaged, lost, or worn out during military service. Equipment maintenance required specialized craftsmen who charged premium prices for their services. Training expenses consumed years of family resources. Before knights could earn any income from their military skills, knights needed education in horsemanship, weapons use, tactics, and the social graces required for interaction with nobility. This training was provided by professional instructors who charged enormous fees for their services. Many families bankrupted themselves, paying for knightly education that might never generate sufficient income to recover the investment. Military service rarely provided adequate compensation for the risks and expenses involved. Knights were expected to serve their lords without direct payment, receiving only a share of any loot or ransom money that resulted from successful military campaigns. Most military campaigns were unsuccessful and generated no income for participating knights, who still had to pay for their equipment, supplies, and medical care. Land grants that were supposed to provide knightly income were often worthless or encumbered with debts and obligations that made them financial liabilities rather than assets. Knights received grants of land that was unproductive, located in dangerous areas, or subject to competing claims that required expensive legal battles to resolve. Many knights discovered that their land grants cost more to maintain than they generated in income. Tax obligations to feudal superiors consumed whatever income knights could generate from their land holdings or military service. Knights owed taxes, military service, and other obligations to multiple levels of feudal hierarchy, creating competing demands that made it impossible to generate surplus wealth. Knights often found themselves owing more in taxes and obligations than they could earn through legitimate means. Debt service consumed increasing portions of knightly income, as economic pressures forced them to borrow money at high interest rates to maintain their equipment and lifestyle. Medieval lending practices included interest rates that would be considered usurious today, and debt collection methods that included seizure of property, imprisonment, and violence. Many knights became trapped in debt cycles that consumed their entire income. Social obligations required knights to maintain expensive lifestyles that demonstrated their status and wealth, even when they couldn't afford such displays. Knights were expected to provide hospitality, give gifts, and participate in social events that required significant financial resources. Failure to meet social expectations could result in loss of status, exclusion from military opportunities, and social isolation. Legal expenses were unavoidable, because knights were frequently involved in disputes over land, inheritance, debt, and other financial matters. Medieval legal systems were expensive, slow, and biased toward wealthy litigants who could afford better representation. Knights often spent years and enormous sums fighting legal battles that they ultimately lost, leaving them poorer than before the disputes began. Insurance was non-existent, meaning that knights bore the full financial risk of their dangerous profession, without any protection against loss. When knights were wounded, their equipment was damaged, or their horses were killed. They absorbed the entire financial loss and had to find money for replacements, or abandon their military careers. There were no safety nets for knights who suffered financial setback. Alternative income sources were limited, because knightly training prepared them only for military service and land management. Knights who couldn't support themselves through military service had few options for generating income through other means. Their education and social status made them unsuitable for manual labor, trade, or other occupations that might have provided financial security. Retirement planning was impossible, because knights had no way to save money for old age or disability. The expenses of maintaining knightly equipment and lifestyle consumed all available income, leaving nothing for future security. Knights who survived long enough to become too old or disabled for military service faced poverty and social irrelevance. Economic competition from other knights created oversupply in the market for military services, driving down the compensation available for knightly military service. Too many knights competed for limited opportunities to serve in profitable military campaigns, participate in lucrative tournaments, or secure valuable land grants. Competition reduced the economic returns available to individual knights. Technological changes made knightly military service less valuable over time, reducing the economic opportunities available to knights. As warfare evolved, the development of professional armies, improved fortifications, and new weapon systems reduced the demand for traditional knightly cavalry service. Knights found themselves economically obsolete as military technology advanced beyond their capabilities. Criminal activity became economically necessary for many knights who couldn't support themselves through legitimate means. Knights turned to banditry, extortion, and theft to generate the income they needed to maintain their equipment and social status. Criminal activity provided short-term financial relief, but created long-term legal problems that often ended knights' careers and lives. The final irony was that successful knights often became targets for robbery, kidnapping, and extortion, because their wealth made them attractive victims. Knights who managed to accumulate money through military service or land management found themselves threatened by other knights, outlaws, and criminals who wanted to steal their wealth. Success in knightly careers often led to increased danger rather than increased security. While knights worried about enemy swords and arrows, the real killers were invisible. Diseases that spread through medieval populations like wildfire and killed more knights than all the battles in history combined. Dysentery was the knight killer that rarely made it into romantic stories. This intestinal disease spread rapidly through military camps, castles, and any place where people lived in close quarters with poor sanitation. Knights died from dehydration and malnutrition as their bodies expelled everything they tried to eat or drink. Dysentery killed entire armies without a single battle being fought, leaving castles full of corpses and abandoned military campaigns. Typhus thrived in the lice-infested conditions that were normal for medieval military life. Knights wore the same clothing for months, slept in communal quarters with poor hygiene, and had no effective way to control lice populations that carried typhus bacteria. The disease caused high fevers, severe headaches, and death rates that could reach 80% in affected populations. Knights died from lice more often than from enemy action. Bubonic plague periodically swept through Europe, killing knights regardless of their armor, training, or social status. The Black Death alone killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population, including substantial numbers of knights who had survived years of military campaigns, only to die from rat-borne bacteria. Plague outbreaks destroyed entire knightly families and ended military careers that had taken decades to establish. Tuberculosis was endemic in medieval populations, and particularly deadly for knights, whose respiratory systems were compromised. By wearing helmets, breathing polluted air, and living in damp, poorly ventilated castles, TB was a slow killer that gradually destroyed lung function while causing weight loss, fatigue, and reduced physical performance. Many knights died from tuberculosis without ever realizing they had the disease. Malaria was common in lowland areas, where castles were built near rivers, swamps, and other water sources that bred mosquitoes. Knights serving in these areas faced recurring bouts of fever, chills, and weakness that could last for months or years. Malaria didn't usually kill quickly, but it weakened knights enough that they died from other diseases or injuries that healthy people might have survived. Smallpox killed knights and disfigured survivors with permanent scars that marked them as disease victims. Smallpox epidemics could kill 30% or more of affected populations, and survivors often suffered from blindness, joint problems, and other complications that ended their military careers. Knights who survived smallpox were often physically and psychologically damaged by the experience. Ergotism was caused by eating bread made from grain contaminated with ergot fungus, which was common during wet growing seasons. Ergot poisoning caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Knights who ate contaminated bread might experience symptoms that resembled mental illness, making them unsuitable for military service. Even if they survived the poisoning, scurvy affected knights during long military campaigns, where fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable. Vitamin C deficiency caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, poor wound healing, and eventually death. Knights who survived battles often died from scurvy during the return journey home, making successful military campaigns fatal for participants who couldn't maintain proper nutrition. Syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through populations of young men who had limited access to sexual partners and no understanding of disease transmission. These diseases caused progressive physical and mental deterioration that could last for years before causing death. Knights infected with syphilis often became unable to perform military duties. As the disease progressed, tetanus killed knights who survived battle wounds, but whose injuries became infected with tetanus bacteria from contaminated soil or weapons. Tetanus caused muscle spasms so severe that they could break bones, and the disease was almost always fatal. Once symptoms developed, knights who thought they had survived combat often died from tetanus weeks or months after their injuries. Gangrene developed in wounds that became infected, particularly in extremities where circulation was poor or had been damaged by injuries. Gangrene required amputation to prevent death, but medieval surgical techniques often killed patients during amputation procedures. Knights faced the choice between certain death from gangrene or probable death from surgery. Pneumonia was common during cold weather, when knights wore damp clothing, slept in unheated quarters, and had respiratory systems weakened by other factors. Pneumonia could kill healthy adults within days, and knights who were already weakened by poor nutrition, injuries, or other diseases were particularly vulnerable. Many knights died from pneumonia during winter campaigns, Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water and food, causing high fevers, intestinal bleeding, and death rates that could exceed 50%. In affected populations, knights who drank from contaminated wells or ate food prepared in unsanitary conditions risked typhoid infection. The disease was particularly dangerous because it could remain dormant and then resurface months later. Anthrax infection occurred when knights handled contaminated animal products, including leather armor, wool clothing, and food products made from infected animals. Anthrax could cause skin lesions, respiratory problems, or intestinal infections that were often fatal. Knights died from anthrax poisoning without understanding how they had become infected. Mental illness was not recognized as a medical condition, but many knights suffered from depression, anxiety, and other psychological problems that affected their health and survival. Knights who couldn't cope with the stress of military life often developed self-destructive behaviors, substance abuse problems, and social isolation that contributed to their physical decline and early death. The lack of medical understanding meant that knights often died from treatable conditions because effective treatments weren't known or available. Knights died from dehydration, malnutrition, and infections that could be easily treated today. Medical ignorance killed more knights than enemy weapons, but these deaths weren't recorded as combat casualties. Disease prevention was impossible because knights had no understanding of how diseases spread or how to prevent infection. Knights shared drinking water, slept in contaminated bedding, and lived in conditions that guaranteed exposure to infectious diseases. Their lifestyle was designed to maximize disease transmission and minimize survival chances. Medical treatment often made diseases worse, rather than better, as knights were subjected to bloodletting, purging, and other treatments that weakened their immune systems and reduced their ability to fight infections. Knights who might have survived diseases with proper care often died because medieval medicine accelerated their decline. Medieval tournaments weren't sporting events. They were barely regulated mass violence, where knights killed each other for entertainment, and the survival rate was so low that participating in tournaments was essentially a slow form of suicide. Melee tournaments involved dozens or hundreds of knights fighting simultaneously in chaotic battles, where the only rule was that there were no rules. Knights used real weapons, wore real armor, and tried to capture or kill as many opponents as possible. These events were essentially small wars, conducted for entertainment, with casualty rates that would be unacceptable. In modern sporting events, jousting was single combat between knights, riding horses at full speed, while trying to knock each other off their mounts with wooden lances. Lances were designed to break on impact, but the force of collision often broke knights instead of lances. Knights died from lance wounds that penetrated armor, from being trampled by horses, and from head injuries caused by falling while wearing heavy helmets. Combat rules were minimal and poorly enforced, because tournament organizers wanted to provide exciting entertainment for spectators who came to see violence and death. Safety regulations existed in theory, but were ignored in practice, because safe tournaments were boring tournaments. Knights participated in events where they were expected to risk their lives for the entertainment of others. Prize money was rarely sufficient to compensate knights for the risks they accepted by participating in tournaments. Knights spent more money on equipment, training, and medical care than they could win in prize money, making tournament participation a losing financial proposition for most knights. The economic incentives encouraged knights to take greater risks for smaller rewards. Medical care at tournaments was primitive, and often made injuries worse, rather than better. Tournament physicians were usually barber surgeons, with minimal training, who treated serious injuries, with procedures that often killed patients. Knights who survived tournament combat often died from medical treatment that was intended to help them recover. Spectator demands for increasingly violent entertainment created pressure for tournament organizers to eliminate safety restrictions and encourage more dangerous forms of combat. Audiences wanted to see blood, injury, and death, creating market incentives for tournaments to become more lethal over time. Knights were under economic pressure to participate in increasingly dangerous events. Training for tournaments required knights to practice with real weapons, under dangerous conditions, creating training injuries that were often as serious as tournament injuries. Knights died during practice sessions, training accidents, and preparation for tournaments that they never got to attend. The training process was nearly as dangerous as the tournaments themselves. Equipment failures during tournaments could be fatal, because knights depended on their armor and weapons for survival during combat. A broken sword, damaged armor, or equipment malfunction could mean immediate death. For knights who were engaged in mortal combat, equipment quality varied dramatically, and knights with inferior equipment often died because their gear failed at critical moments. Social pressure forced knights to participate in tournaments, even when they knew the risks were unacceptable. Knights who refused to participate in tournaments were viewed as cowards and excluded from military opportunities, social events, and political advancement. The social costs of avoiding tournaments were often greater than the physical risks of participating. Political manipulation used tournaments as opportunities to eliminate rivals, settle disputes, and advance personal agendas through legalized violence. Powerful nobles arranged tournaments where their enemies would be killed in accidents that couldn't be prosecuted as murders. Knights were often unknowing participants in political assassination schemes. International tournaments brought together knights from different countries who used different fighting styles, weapons, and rules, creating confusion and dangerous misunderstandings. During combat, knights who were trained in one style of combat found themselves fighting opponents who used unfamiliar techniques and equipment. Cultural differences in tournament customs led to fatal misunderstandings. Betting and gambling on tournament outcomes created financial incentives for spectators and participants to influence results through bribery, sabotage, and other forms of cheating. Knights faced pressure to lose fights, injure specific opponents, or participate in fixed contests that served gambling interests rather than fair competition. Financial corruption made tournaments even more dangerous for honest participants. Religious authorities condemned tournaments as unchristian violence, but were often unable to prevent them because they were popular with both participants and spectators. Popes issued bulls forbidding tournament participation, but these restrictions were widely ignored by knights who needed tournament income and by nobles who enjoyed tournament entertainment. Legal immunity for tournament deaths meant that knights could kill opponents without facing criminal prosecution, as long as the deaths occurred during officially sanctioned combat. This legal protection encouraged reckless behavior and eliminated incentives for knights to show restraint during tournament combat. Knights could commit murder legally as long as they did it in front of an audience. Seasonal tournament circuits required knights to travel constantly and participate in multiple dangerous events each year to maintain their income and reputation. Knights who survived one tournament faced immediate pressure to participate in the next tournament, creating cumulative risks that made long-term survival nearly impossible. The tournament lifestyle was designed to kill participants gradually. Retirement from tournaments was difficult because knights who stopped participating lost their income, social status, and political connections. Knights were trapped in tournament careers that they knew would eventually kill them, but couldn't afford to abandon. Many knights died in tournaments because they continued participating long after their reflexes and physical abilities had declined. The final tragedy was that tournament deaths were celebrated as entertainment rather than mourned as unnecessary losses. Spectators cheered when knights died. Organizers used deaths as marketing tools for future events, and participants were expected to accept mortality as the price of their profession. Tournament culture normalized and celebrated violence in ways that made knightly death inevitable. Forget the fairy tale image of castles as romantic residences. Medieval castles were cold, dark, unhealthy prisons where knights lived in conditions That would be considered torture by modern standards, and where daily life was a constant struggle against disease, discomfort, and early death. Stone construction made castles permanently cold and damp, because medieval building techniques couldn't prevent moisture infiltration or provide adequate heating for large spaces. Stone walls absorbed moisture during wet weather and released it slowly, creating humidity levels that promoted mold, rotted, and respiratory diseases. Knights lived in environments where their clothing, bedding, and food were constantly damp. Heating systems were inadequate and dangerous, because medieval fireplaces were inefficient, smoky, and created fire hazards that could destroy entire castles. Most castle rooms had no heating at all, forcing knights to sleep in freezing conditions while wearing multiple layers of clothing. Knights often died from hypothermia in their own bedrooms. During particularly cold winters, sanitation was primitive and created health hazards that killed more castle residents than enemy attacks. Human waste was disposed of through crude latrine systems that contaminated water supplies, attracted insects and rodents, and created conditions where disease could spread rapidly through castle populations. Knights lived surrounded by their own filth and the waste products of everyone else in the castle. Water supplies were unreliable and often contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and chemical pollutants that caused dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases. Castle wells were contaminated by latrine drainage, dead animals, and industrial waste from blacksmith shops and other castle activities. Knights drank water that was guaranteed to make them sick. Food storage in castles was inadequate and led to spoilage, contamination, and nutritional deficiencies that affected everyone who lived there. Castles had no refrigeration, limited preservation techniques, and storage areas that were vulnerable to rodents, insects, and rot. Knights ate spoiled food because fresh food was rarely available and preservation methods were ineffective. Privacy was non-existent. Because castle construction emphasized defense over comfort, creating living spaces where multiple people shared small rooms with no sound insulation or visual barriers. Knights couldn't escape from the constant presence of other people, creating psychological stress and social conflicts that contributed to violence and mental health problems. Lighting was provided by candles, torches, and oil lamps that were expensive, dangerous, and provided inadequate illumination for most activities. Castle interiors were dark, even during daylight hours, because windows were small to prevent enemy entry. Knights lived in perpetual twilight that strained their eyes and limited their ability to perform detailed tasks. Ventilation was poor, because castle design prioritized defense over air circulation, creating stuffy interiors where smoke, cooking odors, and human body odors accumulated to create toxic atmospheric conditions. Knights breathed air that was contaminated with smoke from fireplaces, fumes from oil lamps, and the collective exhalations of everyone else in the castle. Maintenance was constant and expensive, because stone structures required ongoing repairs to prevent collapse, water infiltration, and other structural problems. Knights spent enormous amounts of time and money maintaining their castles, often going into debt to pay for repairs that were necessary for basic habitability. Castle maintenance consumed resources that could have been used for other purposes. Security measures made castles into prisons for their own residents, who couldn't leave without permission and couldn't receive visitors without extensive security procedures. Knights lived under constant surveillance and restriction, unable to come and go freely or maintain normal social relationships with people outside the castle. Social isolation was inevitable, because castles were often located in remote areas for defensive purposes, cutting residents off from towns, markets, and other centers of social activity. Knights lived in social isolation that created psychological problems and limited their opportunities for personal and professional development. Noise pollution was constant because castle construction amplified sounds rather than dampening them, creating acoustic environments where every conversation, argument, and activity could be heard throughout the structure. Knights couldn't escape from noise, creating stress and sleep deprivation that affected their health and performance. Pest control was impossible, because medieval techniques couldn't eliminate the rats, mice, insects, and other vermin that thrived in castle environments. Knights shared their living spaces with rodents that contaminated food, spread disease, and created unsanitary conditions. Some castles had rat populations that outnumbered human residents. Medical facilities were non-existent in most castles, leaving residents without access to medical care when they became sick or injured. Knights who needed medical attention often had to travel long distances to find physicians, and many died from treatable conditions because medical care wasn't available when they needed it. Storage space was limited and poorly organized, creating crowded conditions where personal belongings, weapons, and supplies were damaged by moisture, pests, and poor handling. Knights couldn't properly maintain their equipment because storage conditions were inadequate for preserving metal, leather, and fabric items that required specific environmental conditions. Construction quality varied dramatically, and many castles were built by unskilled laborers using inferior materials and techniques that created structural problems, safety hazards, and habitability issues. Knights lived in buildings that were prone to collapse, water infiltration, and other problems that made daily life dangerous and uncomfortable. The final irony was that castles were supposed to provide security and comfort for knights, but they actually created health problems and social isolation that shortened knights' lives and reduced their quality of life. Knights spent enormous resources building and maintaining structures that made their lives worse rather than better, creating self-imposed prisons that they couldn't escape because they had invested too much to abandon them. The medieval code of chivalry that modern people admire was a literary invention created centuries after most real knights had died. Actual knights lived by a much simpler code. Take whatever you can get, kill whoever gets in your way, and don't trust anyone who might profit from your death. Courtly romance was pure fiction, written by poets who had never met real knights, and who created idealized versions of knightly behavior for entertainment purposes. These stories were medieval fantasy literature, not historical documents, but modern people have confused entertainment with reality. Real knights were more likely to rape peasant women than rescue noble ladies, and their relationships with women were based on property rights rather than romantic love. Protection of the innocent was economically impossible, because knights earned their living by exploiting the innocent. Knights couldn't afford to protect people who couldn't pay for protection, and they often created the dangers. They were supposedly protecting people from. The innocent were knights' victims, not their beneficiaries. And knights who tried to protect innocent people usually went bankrupt and lost their ability to help anyone. Honor was a luxury that most knights couldn't afford, because honorable behavior was often economically ruinous or physically suicidal. Knights who kept their word, treated enemies fairly, and refused to take advantage of opportunities for personal gain were outcompeted by knights who were willing to lie, cheat, and kill for advancement. The medieval world rewarded ruthlessness and punished honor. Religious devotion among knights was often superficial and self-serving, because genuine religious principles conflicted with the violence and exploitation that were essential parts of knightly careers. Knights who took religious teaching seriously found themselves unable to perform the duties that their profession required. Most knights compartmentalized their religious beliefs and their professional activities. Loyalty to feudal superiors was conditional and temporary, because knights changed allegiances whenever it served their interests. Knights served whatever lord could provide the best opportunities for advancement, and they betrayed former allies when new opportunities arose. Feudal loyalty was a business relationship, not a moral commitment, and knights who took loyalty too seriously were often destroyed by more pragmatic colleagues. Justice was whatever served knightly interests. At any particular moment, knights applied different standards of justice to different social classes, different situations, and different personal relationships. They used justice as a tool for advancing their own interests, rather than as a universal principle that applied to everyone equally. Knights were above the law when it served them, and quick to invoke the law when it protected them. Bravery was often indistinguishable from stupidity, recklessness, or lack of alternative options. Knights who appeared brave were often just too ignorant to understand the risks they were taking, too desperate to care about consequences, or too trapped by circumstances to choose safer alternatives. Many acts of knightly bravery were actually evidence of poor judgment, inadequate planning, or simple desperation. Courtesy was reserved for people who could help or harm knights' careers, while people of lower social status were treated with contempt, violence, and exploitation. Knights were courteous to their superiors and peers, while being brutal to their inferiors. Courtesy was a political tool, not a moral principle, and knights adjusted their behavior based on the social status and usefulness of the people they were dealing with. Generosity was usually motivated by political calculation rather than genuine altruism. Knights gave gifts, provided hospitality, and offered assistance when they expected to benefit from these actions. Knightly generosity was investment rather than charity, and knights who were generous without expecting returns usually found themselves impoverished and unable to help anyone. Truth-telling was selective and situational, because knights needed to lie regularly to survive and advance in their careers. Knights lied to their enemies, their allies, their superiors, and their subordinates, whenever honesty would be disadvantageous. The ability to lie convincingly was an essential knightly skill, and knights who were compulsively honest were usually unsuccessful. Mercy was rare, because showing mercy to enemies created risks and opportunities for revenge. Knights who spared defeated enemies often found themselves killed by the same people they had shown mercy to. Mercy was viewed as weakness and stupidity rather than virtue, and knights who were merciful were often eliminated by more ruthless competitors. Education in chivalric ideals was provided by people who had never been knights and who created unrealistic expectations about knightly behavior that had no connection to the practical realities of medieval warfare and politics. Young nobles were taught idealized versions of knighthood that prepared them poorly for the actual demands of their careers. Literature about chivalry was written primarily for entertainment and political propaganda, rather than historical accuracy. Writers created stories that promoted political messages, satisfied audience expectations for exciting entertainment, and flattered the people who paid for their work. Chivalric literature was fiction, not documentary evidence of actual knightly behavior. Religious institutions promoted chivalric ideals as a way to control knightly violence and direct it toward objectives that served church interests. The church created standards of knightly behavior that would make knights more useful to religious authorities, while reducing the threats that knights posed to church property and personnel. Legal codes that supposedly governed knightly behavior were rarely enforced and were often ignored. When enforcement would be inconvenient for powerful interests, knights were above the law in many situations, and legal codes existed primarily to provide legitimacy for actions that knights were going to take anyway, rather than to constrain knightly behavior. Modern romanticization of chivalry serves contemporary political and cultural purposes, rather than historical accuracy. People who promote chivalric ideals are usually trying to advance modern agendas, rather than describe medieval realities. The chivalric code that modern people admire never existed in medieval times, and wouldn't have been practical or sustainable if it had been attempted. The tragic irony was that knights, who actually tried to live according to chivalric ideals, usually died young, poor, and forgotten, because the medieval world was too brutal and competitive to reward idealistic behavior. The knights who survived and prospered were the ones who ignored chivalric ideals and focused on practical survival and advancement strategies. Medieval warfare was fundamentally pointless destruction that impoverished everyone involved, while accomplishing no meaningful political, economic, or social objectives. Knights spent their lives fighting wars that made the world worse for everyone, including themselves. Territorial disputes were usually fights over worthless land that cost more to conquer and hold than it could ever generate in economic value. Knights died capturing swamps, wastelands, and marginal agricultural areas that couldn't support the military forces required to defend them. Most territorial wars left both winners and losers. Poorer than before the fighting started, succession conflicts destroyed entire kingdoms over disputes about which incompetent royal relative should inherit the right to tax and oppress the population. Knights fought civil wars that killed thousands of people to determine whether one useless monarch or another useless monarch would occupy the throne. These wars typically resulted in the least capable claimant becoming ruler. Religious wars were fought over theological differences that had no practical impact on daily life, but provided convenient excuses for lords who wanted to steal property, eliminate rivals, and expand their territories. Knights killed each other over religious questions that they didn't understand, while their leaders pursued secular objectives that they couldn't admit publicly. Trade wars were fought to control commercial routes and markets, but the cost of fighting usually exceeded the economic benefits of victory. Knights died protecting trade that was destroyed by the military campaigns designed to protect it. Most trade wars ended with everyone involved being poorer and less secure than before the fighting began. Alliance systems created situations where knights were obligated to fight in wars that had nothing to do with their own interests or security. Knights died fulfilling alliance obligations that benefited other people, while creating enemies and debts for themselves. Complex alliance networks meant that minor local disputes could escalate into major international wars that accomplished nothing except widespread destruction. Dynastic marriages were supposed to prevent wars, but usually just created more complex reasons for fighting. Knights fought wars to enforce marriage contracts, disputed dowries and inheritance claims that resulted from political marriages. Dynastic politics created international conflicts over personal disputes between royal families who viewed entire kingdoms as their private property. Crusading expeditions were military disasters that killed more Christians than Muslims, while bankrupting everyone who participated in them. Knights mortgaged their lands, sold their possessions, and borrowed money to finance religious wars that accomplished nothing except creating opportunities for merchants and moneylenders to profit from knightly desperation. Most crusaders died from disease, starvation, or getting lost, rather than from combat with religious enemies. Border raids were continuous low-level warfare that prevented economic development, terrorized civilian populations, and created cycles of revenge that lasted for generations. Knights spent their lives participating in raids that destroyed agricultural productivity, disrupted trade, and created poverty that made everyone less secure. Border warfare was economically destructive for all participants. Siege warfare was particularly pointless because most sieges lasted longer than the economic value of whatever was being besieged. Knights spent months or years attacking fortifications that cost more to capture than they were worth, while defenders spent equivalent resources defending positions that weren't worth the cost of defense. Most sieges ended with both sides being weaker than before the siege began. Naval warfare was prohibitively expensive and usually accomplished nothing except destroying ships and killing sailors. Knights who participated in naval campaigns often lost more money on ships and equipment than they could gain from any possible victory. Maritime warfare was typically a net loss for everyone involved, except the people who built and supplied ships. Mercenary conflicts were fought by professional soldiers who had no stake in the outcomes, and who often switched sides based on whoever paid better wages. Knights fought alongside mercenaries who might become enemies in the next campaign, creating military situations where tactical knowledge and strategic plans were shared with potential future opponents. Technological warfare created arms races that consumed enormous resources. While providing minimal tactical advantages, knights bankrupted themselves, acquiring new weapons and defensive technologies that were quickly made obsolete by counter-innovations. Military technology advanced faster than economic systems could support, creating financial pressures that destroyed knightly families. Weather-dependent campaigns failed when armies couldn't operate effectively during adverse weather conditions, which was most of the time. In medieval Europe, knights planned military campaigns around weather patterns that were unpredictable and often hostile to military operations. Most campaigns were cancelled, postponed, or failed due to weather rather than enemy action. Logistical failures ended more military campaigns than battlefield defeats, because medieval armies couldn't maintain supply lines over long distances or extended time periods. Knights died from starvation, disease, and exposure while participating in military campaigns that failed because they couldn't be adequately supplied. Military logistics were beyond the capabilities of medieval political and economic systems. Political instability meant that military victories were often meaningless because governments couldn't maintain control over conquered territories. Knights captured territories that were immediately lost to rebellions, rival claimants, or administrative incompetence. Military success didn't translate into political control or economic benefit. Communication problems meant that armies often fought battles based on outdated information, conflicting orders, or complete misunderstandings about strategic objectives. Knights participated in military campaigns without understanding their purposes, their chances of success, or their roles in larger strategic plans. Many battles were fought for reasons that no longer existed. By the time the fighting actually occurred, economic warfare was more effective than military warfare, but knights were poorly equipped to engage in economic competition. Knights understood violence, but not finance, trade, or economic strategy. They lost economic wars to merchants and bankers who used financial weapons that knights couldn't understand or counter. Diplomatic alternatives were usually available, but were ignored because knights were trained for violence and had economic incentives to fight rather than negotiate. Many wars could have been prevented or ended through negotiation, but knights needed wars to justify their existence and generate income. Peace was economically threatening to people whose careers depended on conflict. War profits went primarily to merchants, money lenders, and weapons manufacturers, rather than to the knights, who did the actual fighting. Knights borrowed money to finance wars, bought equipment from profiteers, and hired services from people who grew wealthy, while knights grew poorer. The military-industrial complex of medieval times enriched everyone except the soldiers. Long-term consequences of medieval warfare included economic devastation, population decline, technological stagnation, and social instability that lasted for generations. After individual wars ended, knights fought wars that made their own world less prosperous, less secure, and less civilized. Military solutions created more problems than they solved. The ultimate futility was that successful military commanders often found themselves with nothing to do during peacetime except prepare for the next war. Knights who were effective soldiers were usually incompetent administrators, so military victories created political problems that led to more wars. Success in warfare guaranteed continued warfare rather than lasting peace. Being a knight meant complete alienation from normal human society, living in a violent subculture that destroyed your ability to form meaningful relationships or participate in the civilian community that you were supposedly protecting. Class segregation isolated knights from the majority of the population, who viewed them as dangerous predators rather than protectors. Peasants feared knights because knights were the primary threat to peasants' safety and prosperity. Knights couldn't form friendships or romantic relationships with people they routinely robbed, threatened, and killed. The social distance between knights and commoners was maintained through mutual hostility and suspicion. Professional isolation meant that knights could only relate to other knights, creating an echo chamber of violence and dysfunction, where abnormal behavior was normalized and healthy behavior was viewed as weakness. Knights lost perspective on normal human behavior because they were surrounded by people who shared their distorted worldview. Social groups consisting entirely of professional killers developed group psychology that was destructive to individual mental health. Geographic isolation was common because knights lived in castles, military camps, and fortified positions that were separated from civilian communities for defensive purposes. Knights spent most of their time in military environments, where the only other people were soldiers, servants, and prisoners. This isolation from civilian life made knights increasingly unable to function in peaceful social settings. Cultural isolation developed because knightly subculture was so different from mainstream medieval culture that knights couldn't participate meaningfully in normal social, religious, and cultural activities. Knights were trained to solve problems through violence, while civilian culture emphasized cooperation, negotiation, and peaceful conflict resolution. These incompatible approaches to life created cultural barriers that knights couldn't overcome. Communication barriers emerged because knights spoke a specialized language of violence, military tactics, and feudal politics that was incomprehensible to civilians, while civilians discussed topics that knights found irrelevant or incomprehensible. Knights couldn't engage in normal conversation because their experiences and interests were so different from those of civilian society. Economic isolation occurred because knights earned their living through violence and exploitation, rather than through productive economic activity. Knights couldn't participate in normal economic relationships because their wealth came from taking rather than making. This economic separation created social barriers that reinforced other forms of isolation. Educational isolation developed because knightly education focused exclusively on military skills and ignored the intellectual, artistic, and cultural knowledge that was valued by civilian society. Knights were ignorant of literature, philosophy, science, and art that formed the basis of civilized conversation. Their education made them unsuitable for civilian social interaction. Religious isolation emerged because the violent nature of knightly careers conflicted with religious teachings about peace, mercy, and compassion. Knights couldn't participate fully in religious communities because their profession required them to violate religious principles regularly. Religious authorities often viewed knights with suspicion and disapproval. Emotional isolation was inevitable because knights had to suppress normal human emotions that would interfere with their ability to kill efficiently. Knights couldn't afford to feel empathy, compassion, or emotional attachment because these feelings made them vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation by enemies. Emotional suppression necessary for military effectiveness made knights incapable of normal emotional relationships. Psychological trauma from repeated exposure to violence created mental health problems that made knights unsuitable for civilian society. Knights suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but medieval society had no understanding of psychological trauma or treatment for combat-related mental health problems. Knights with psychological problems were viewed as dangerous and unstable, rather than as people needing medical care. Social skills atrophied because knights lived in environments where social interaction was based on hierarchy, intimidation, and violence, rather than mutual respect and cooperation. Knights learned to interact with people as superiors to be obeyed, equals to be competed with, or inferiors to be dominated. These social skills were inappropriate and counterproductive in civilian social settings. Trust issues developed because knights lived in environments where betrayal was common and trust could be fatal. Knights learned to view everyone as potential enemies and to maintain psychological barriers that prevented intimate relationships. The paranoia necessary for survival in knightly careers made knights incapable of forming close personal relationships. Seasonal isolation occurred because military campaigns often lasted for months, separating knights from whatever civilian social connections they might have maintained. Knights who spent most of their time on military campaigns lost touch with civilian friends and family members who couldn't understand or relate to their experiences. Age-related isolation developed as knights who survived to middle age found themselves increasingly separated from civilian society by their accumulation of violent experiences and psychological trauma. Older knights were often so damaged by their careers that they couldn't relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences. Veterans became increasingly isolated as they accumulated more trauma. Social stigma attached to knights, who were known for particular cruelties or failures, created additional barriers to social integration. Knights who had reputations for brutality, cowardice, or dishonor found themselves excluded from social groups and unable to find acceptance, even among other knights. Social reputation could make knights complete outcasts. Family alienation was common because knightly careers created psychological and social changes that made knights unable to function as husbands, fathers, or family members. Knights who tried to maintain family relationships often found that their violent careers had made them unsuitable for family life. Many knights abandoned their families or were abandoned by family members who couldn't tolerate their behavior. The final tragedy was that knights who survived long enough to retire from military careers often found themselves completely unable to integrate into civilian society. They had spent so many years isolated from normal human relationships that they couldn't learn to live peacefully among civilians. Knights who survived their military careers often died alone and forgotten, separated from the society they had supposedly served. When knights finally died, which most did before reaching 30, they left behind no meaningful accomplishments, no lasting improvements to society, and no legacy except destruction, debt, and the traumatized survivors of their violent. Historical impact was overwhelmingly negative because knights were agents of oppression who prevented social progress, economic development, and political stability. Knights maintained feudal systems that kept the majority of the population in poverty and slavery, while preventing the emergence of more equitable and productive social organizations. The existence of knights delayed human progress by centuries. Economic legacy consisted primarily of debt, destroyed property, and impoverished communities. That took generations to recover from knightly exploitation. Knights consumed wealth without creating it, destroyed infrastructure without replacing it, and left economic devastation that affected entire regions. The economic impact of knightly careers was almost entirely negative for everyone except weapons manufacturers and moneylenders. Social legacy included traumatized populations who had been terrorized by knights, broken families whose members had been killed or enslaved by knights, and social institutions that had been destroyed by knightly violence. Knights left behind communities that were less stable, less prosperous, and less civilized than they had been before knights arrived. Political legacy consisted of weakened governments, territorial disputes that continued for generations, and political instability that prevented effective governance. Knights created political problems rather than solving them, and their involvement in politics usually made governmental systems less effective and less responsive to popular needs. Cultural legacy was minimal because knights contributed little to art, literature, science, or intellectual development. Knights were consumers rather than creators of culture, and their anti-intellectual warrior culture was hostile to the educational and cultural development that produced lasting human achievements. Knightly culture was a cultural dead end that produced nothing of value. Technological legacy was limited to weapons and military equipment that were designed for destruction rather than creation. Knights contributed to military technology but ignored productive technologies that could have improved human living conditions. Their technological priorities reflected their destructive rather than constructive orientation toward human problems. Religious legacy was negative because knights used religion to justify violence, while violating religious principles through their behavior. Knights corrupted religious institutions by involving them in political conflicts and by using religious authority to legitimize activities that contradicted religious teachings. Knightly involvement in religion was destructive to authentic religious development. Family legacy was often non-existent because knights died young, abandoned their families, or were estranged from family members who couldn't tolerate their violent careers. Knights who had children often left them worse off than if they had never been born, because knightly careers created debts, enemies, and social stigma that affected subsequent generations. Educational legacy was negative because knights promoted anti-intellectual values that discouraged learning, critical thinking, and intellectual development. Knightly culture viewed education as weakness and ignorance as strength, creating cultural attitudes that hindered human intellectual progress. Knights taught people to solve problems through violence rather than through knowledge and understanding. Literary legacy consisted primarily of fictional romantic stories that misrepresented knightly reality and created unrealistic expectations about violence, warfare, and social relationships. The literary tradition that grew up around knights was almost entirely fictional and served to perpetuate myths that prevented people from understanding the actual nature of medieval society. Architectural legacy included castles and fortifications that were designed for war rather than for productive human activity. Knightly architecture was focused on defense and intimidation rather than on creating beautiful or functional spaces. For human habitation, castle architecture reflected the paranoid and hostile mentality of knightly culture. Legal legacy consisted of laws that protected knightly privileges while oppressing everyone else in society. Knights created and maintained legal systems that were designed to serve knightly interests rather than to provide justice for all members of society. Knightly involvement in legal development was destructive to the development of fair and effective legal systems. Environmental legacy was negative because knightly warfare destroyed agricultural land, forests, and other natural resources without regard for environmental consequences. Knights treated the natural environment as a resource to be exploited for military purposes rather than as a shared heritage to be preserved for future generations. Scientific legacy was non-existent because knights were hostile to scientific inquiry and rational analysis. Knightly culture was based on tradition, superstition, and authority rather than on empirical investigation and logical reasoning. Knights hindered rather than helped the development of scientific knowledge and methodology. Artistic legacy was limited because knights valued martial skills over artistic expression and viewed artists as inferior to warriors. Knightly culture was aesthetically impoverished and produced little art of lasting value. The warrior culture that knights represented was hostile to the creative expression that produces great art. The ultimate irony was that knights, who spent their lives pursuing glory and honor, achieved neither. They were quickly forgotten by history, remembered primarily as examples of human brutality and social dysfunction. The knights who thought they were creating heroic legacies actually created cautionary tales about the dangers of militaristic culture and social inequality. Most knights died without understanding that their lives had been wasted on pursuits that accomplished nothing positive for themselves or for society. They believed the myths about knightly honor and chivalric virtue until the moment they died from dysentery in a field hospital, surrounded by other dying men who had wasted their lives in the same pointless pursuits. The real legacy of medieval knights was the lesson that violence is not heroic, that military solutions create more problems than they solve, and that societies that celebrate warriors rather than builders are doomed to stagnation and decline. Knights were historical failures whose careers demonstrated the futility of trying to build civilization on a foundation of organized violence. After examining the brutal reality of medieval knighthood, one conclusion becomes inescapable. There was no honor in being a professional killer for feudal overlords, and the only glory was in the imagination of people who never experienced the reality of knightly life. The honor that knights supposedly represented was a literary fiction created by people who romanticized violence they had never experienced. Real honor requires moral courage, ethical behavior, and concern for others' welfare, qualities that were incompatible with knightly careers. Knights who tried to behave honorably usually died quickly because honor was a luxury that the medieval world couldn't afford. Glory was equally fictional because there was nothing glorious about dying young from preventable diseases, living in constant fear and discomfort, or spending your life terrorizing innocent people for money. The glory of knighthood existed only in stories written by people who confused violence with virtue and who mistook military success for moral achievement. Heroism was impossible in a system where heroes were defeated by reality before they could accomplish anything meaningful. Knights who tried to be heroic found themselves fighting against systems of oppression that they were part of, trying to protect people from violence that they themselves were committing. True heroes work to eliminate the conditions that create the need for heroes, but knights perpetuated the conditions that made their existence seem necessary. Chivalry was a contradiction in terms, because it attempted to apply civilized standards to fundamentally uncivilized activities. You cannot conduct warfare ethically, exploit people honorably, or kill compassionately. The attempt to create ethical guidelines for unethical activities produces only hypocrisy and self-deception. Nobility was not about birth or social status, but about character and behavior, which means that most knights were not noble in any meaningful sense. True nobility requires using power and privilege to help others, rather than to exploit them. But knights used their power to extract wealth from people who were less powerful than themselves. Service was not about serving feudal lords, but about serving human needs and advancing human welfare. Knights served the interests of their social superiors, rather than the broader interests of humanity. Their service was narrow, selfish, and destructive, rather than broad, generous, and constructive. Courage was not about facing physical danger, but about facing moral challenges and making difficult ethical choices. Physical courage without moral courage is just recklessness or desperation. Knights displayed physical courage, while lacking the moral courage to question the systems they served, or to challenge the authorities who exploited them. Sacrifice was not about dying for causes, but about living for principles. Knights who died in battle were not making sacrifices. They were experiencing the predictable consequences of their career choices. True sacrifice involves giving up personal advantages to benefit others, but knights pursued personal advancement through activities that harmed others. Justice was not about enforcing the will of the powerful, but about creating fair systems that protect everyone's rights and interests. Knights enforced selective justice that served the interests of their social class, while oppressing everyone else. They were agents of injustice, disguised as agents of justice. Leadership was not about commanding others through fear and intimidation, but about inspiring others through example and vision. Knights led through violence and coercion, rather than through moral authority and intellectual capability. Their leadership was based on force, rather than consent, fear, rather than respect. The romantic vision of knighthood that persists in modern culture serves contemporary purposes, rather than historical accuracy. People who promote knightly ideals are usually trying to advance modern agendas, rather than understand medieval realities. The appeal of knightly romance lies in its distance from reality, rather than its connection to truth. Education systems that teach children to admire knights are teaching them to admire violence, exploitation, and social inequality. Children who learn to think of knights as heroes are being prepared to accept contemporary versions of the same problems that made medieval society so brutal and unjust. Cultural products that romanticize knights contribute to contemporary problems by promoting unrealistic expectations about violence, masculinity, and social relationships. Movies, books, and games that portray knights as heroes are propaganda for value systems that are destructive to human welfare and social progress. Political movements that invoke knightly imagery are usually trying to legitimize contemporary forms of violence, exploitation, and authoritarianism. Politicians who present themselves as knights are claiming the right to use violence and coercion to impose their will on others. The ultimate lesson of medieval knighthood is that societies that celebrate warriors rather than creators, that honor violence rather than cooperation, and that value individual glory rather than collective welfare, are doomed to repeat the mistakes that made medieval life so brutal and short. Modern people who admire knights are admiring their own ignorance about historical reality and their own susceptibility to romantic propaganda that disguises ugly truths about power, violence, and social inequality. The continuing appeal of knightly romance reflects contemporary moral confusion rather than historical wisdom. Knights were not heroes, role models, or examples of human nobility. They were historical failures whose careers demonstrated the futility of trying to build good lives through bad means, and whose legacy consists primarily of cautionary tales about the dangers of militaristic culture. The real heroes of medieval times were the people who created rather than destroyed, who built rather than conquered, and who worked to improve human conditions rather than to exploit human weakness. These people left behind art, architecture, knowledge, and institutions that improved human life, while knights left behind only ruins and regrets. You couldn't survive a week as a medieval knight, not because you lack courage, strength, or martial skill, but because knightly life was designed to consume human beings as efficiently as possible. While accomplishing nothing of lasting value, knights were trapped in a system that destroyed everyone who participated in it, including the knights themselves. The armor rusted, the castles crumbled, the horses died, and the knights were forgotten. But the idea that violence could be noble, that exploitation could be honorable, and that might could make right, these ideas survived to poison subsequent generations with the same delusion that killed medieval knights and made medieval society such a nightmare for everyone, except the people who profited from the suffering of others. Let's continue with some stories. The morning you realized your nightly dreams were built on corpses began like any other morning. In the service of Sir Godwin de Montfort, except this time the screaming from the village below lasted longer than usual. You had been his squire for 8 months now, long enough to understand that the romantic notions of chivalry your father had filled your head with were about as real as dragons and fairy godmothers, but not long enough to completely abandon the desperate hope that somewhere beneath the brutality lay something resembling honor. Your hands shook as you helped Sir Godwin into his armor, the same hands that had once trembled with excitement at the prospect of serving a real knight. Now they trembled for different reasons. The mail hauberk felt heavier each morning, not because it had gained weight, but because you were beginning to understand what it represented. This wasn't protection for a noble protector of the innocent. This was work clothing for a professional murderer, and you were his assistant. The smell of smoke drifted through the narrow window slits of the tower where you were dressing your master. Another village was burning. The third this month, Sir Godwin had explained the tactical necessity of destroying villages that couldn't pay their taxes, but his explanation sounded increasingly hollow as you watched families flee their burning homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. These weren't military targets. These were farming communities whose only crime was failing to produce enough surplus to satisfy the endless appetites of feudal taxation. Sir Godwin's morning routine never varied. First came the padded undergarments, soaked with yesterday's sweat and stained with substances you preferred not to identify. Then the mail, link by link, until he resembled a metal scarecrow more than a human being. The process took nearly an hour, during which time he would outline the day's activities with the casual tone of a merchant planning a shopping trip to market. Today's agenda included collecting overdue rents from 3 villages, investigating reports of peasant unrest in the eastern settlements, and executing a farmer who had been caught hunting deer in the Lord's forest. The execution was scheduled for noon, which meant you had the morning to contemplate how completely your life had diverged from everything you had once hoped it would become. You had dreamed of rescuing maidens, defending the weak, and earning glory through noble deeds. Instead, you spent your days helping a man who made his living terrorizing people who couldn't defend themselves. The maiden rescuing had turned out to be mostly rape. The defending of the weak had become systematic oppression of the powerless. And the noble deeds were actually criminal acts that happened to be legal when performed by people with the right social connection. Your education in the reality of knighthood had begun on your first day of service, when Sir Godwin had explained your duties with the matter-of-fact tone of a craftsman training an apprentice. You would maintain his equipment, care for his horse, assist with his armor, and observe his methods so that you could eventually become equally effective at extracting wealth from peasants through violence and intimidation. The word chivalry had never come up in these practical discussions about your career development. The horse you cared for was a magnificent destrier named Thunder, a name that had initially seemed romantic and exciting until you realized that the horse's primary function was to provide mobility for raids on defenseless villages. Thunder was trained to charge into crowds of unarmed peasants, to trample anyone who couldn't get out of the way quickly enough, and to carry Sir Godwin away from dangerous situations where his victims might organize effective resistance. The horse was an accessory to mass murder, and you were responsible for keeping him in peak condition for maximum killing efficiency. Equipment maintenance had turned out to be an education in the tools of professional violence. Sir Godwin's sword wasn't the elegant blade of romantic literature, but a crude chopping tool designed to hack through bone and flesh as efficiently as possible. His mace could crush skulls inside helmets. His dagger was specifically designed for stabbing through the gaps in armor. Every piece of equipment in his arsenal was an instrument of torture optimized for causing maximum human suffering in minimum time. The armor you helped him don each morning wasn't shining plate mail, but a collection of battered metal pieces that had been repaired so many times they resembled patchwork quilts more than protective equipment. The repairs told stories about previous battles, each dent and scratch representing someone who had died trying to stop Sir Godwin from killing them or stealing their property. You polished armor that was literally stained with the blood of his victims, and the stains never quite came out no matter how hard you scrubbed. Your sleeping quarters in the castle tower provided a perfect vantage point for observing the results of Sir Godwin's professional activities. From your narrow window you could see the burned villages, the abandoned farms, and the refugees who camped in the forests because they had nowhere else to go. These people had been systematically impoverished by the feudal system that you were training to join. They were living evidence of the true nature of knightly careers, and their suffering was a constant reminder of what your future held. The other squires in the castle were at various stages of the same educational process that was destroying your illusions about knighthood. Some had adapted to the reality by abandoning their moral sensibilities entirely, becoming enthusiastic participants in activities that would have horrified their younger selves. Others had developed psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to perform their duties without thinking about the consequences of their actions. A few had simply gone insane from the cognitive dissonance between their expectations and reality. Your conversations with these other squires had revealed the universal nature of your disillusionment. All of them had arrived with similar romantic notions about knightly honor and chivalric virtue. All of them had discovered that actual knighthood bore no resemblance to the stories they had been told. Most had found ways to cope with this discovery, but the coping mechanisms invariably involved some form of moral compromise that left them psychologically damaged. Thomas, who had been a squire for 2 years, had developed a talent for creative rationalization that allowed him to justify any atrocity as necessary for maintaining social order. He could explain why burning villages prevented larger conflicts, why executing poachers protected wildlife, and why raping peasant women taught them to respect their social superiors. His explanations were logically sophisticated, but morally bankrupt, demonstrating how intelligent people could train themselves to believe anything that made their lives more comfortable. William had chosen a different adaptation strategy, compartmentalizing his personality so that he could perform nightly duties without allowing them to affect his sense of personal identity. He participated in raids, executions, and systematic oppression, while maintaining that these activities didn't reflect his true character. This psychological split allowed him to function professionally while preserving some sense of moral self-worth, but it also made him increasingly disconnected from reality. Jeffrey had simply embraced the brutality, deciding that if knighthood required him to become a monster, he would become the most effective monster possible. He took pride in his efficiency at violence, his creativity in devising new forms of intimidation, and his ability to extract wealth from peasants who had nothing left to give. His adaptation was perhaps the most honest, but it was also the most disturbing because it represented the complete abandonment of human empathy. Your own adaptation had been to retreat into increasingly desperate hope that somewhere within the system lay opportunities for genuine heroism. You told yourself that you could learn the skills of knighthood without embracing its moral corruption, that you could find ways to use violence for good rather than evil, that you could somehow transform the role of knight from oppressor to protector. These hopes were becoming harder to maintain as you witnessed the daily reality of what knights actually did. The morning's first task was to accompany Sir Godwin on his rent collection rounds, a euphemism for armed robbery conducted under the protection of feudal law. The villages you visited were populated by people who had already given everything they could afford, and were now being asked to give more. They looked at Sir Godwin with the mixture of fear and hatred that was the normal response to his presence, and they looked at you with disappointment, as if they could see your potential for decency and were saddened by its inevitable corruption. The rent collection process followed a predictable pattern. Sir Godwin would announce the amounts owed, the villagers would explain that they had already paid everything they had, and Sir Godwin would select examples to motivate better compliance from the others. The examples usually involved public beatings, property destruction, or threats against family members. The process was designed to terrorize entire communities into compliance while maintaining plausible deniability about the use of force. Your role in these proceedings was to observe and learn, to understand the techniques that made rent collection efficient, and to prepare yourself for the day when you would conduct similar operations independently. Sir Godwin provided running commentary on his methods, explaining the psychology of intimidation, the economics of optimal taxation, and the political benefits of maintaining fear-based social control. His instruction was professionally competent but morally horrifying. The villagers' responses to these rent collection visits revealed their complete understanding of the system they were trapped in. They knew that resistance would result in escalated violence, that compliance would lead to increased demands, and that there was no legal recourse available to people in their social position. They were trapped in a system designed to extract maximum wealth from their labor, while providing no benefits in return. Their resignation was more heartbreaking than their fear. The children in these villages were particularly disturbing to observe because they represented the next generation of victims who would grow up accepting systematic oppression as normal. They watched the rent collection proceedings with the wide-eyed attention of students learning important lessons about how the world worked. They were receiving an education in helplessness that would prepare them for lives of subservience to people like Sir Godwin and eventually like you. The economic impact of rent collection was visible in the progressive deterioration of village conditions over the months you had been observing them. Houses were becoming more ramshackle as families sold construction materials to pay taxes. Gardens were smaller as people ate their seed corn to avoid starvation. Livestock herds were shrinking as animals were sold to meet financial obligations. The feudal system was systematically consuming the productive capacity of the region. The midday execution provided your education in the judicial functions of knighthood, which turned out to be as corrupt and brutal as everything else about the profession. The farmer who was scheduled to die had been caught hunting deer in the Lord's forest, a crime that carried the death penalty not because it was inherently heinous, but because it represented a challenge to feudal property rights. The execution was intended to deter other peasants from attempting to feed their families through unauthorized hunting. The legal proceedings that had condemned the farmer consisted of a brief hearing where Sir Godwin served as judge, jury, and executioner. There was no defense attorney, no examination of evidence, and no consideration of mitigating circumstances. The farmer's guilt was assumed from the moment he was accused, and the only question was whether he would be hanged, beheaded, or subjected to some more creative form of execution that would provide better deterrent effects. The farmer's family had come to witness the execution, not because they wanted to see their husband and father die, but because they hoped to recover his body for burial. Medieval law allowed the families of executed criminals to claim the corpses, provided they could pay the fees associated with body recovery. The family had scraped together enough money to pay these fees, money that they desperately needed for food and shelter, but that they were willing to sacrifice for the dignity of proper burial. Your job during the execution was to manage the crowd, ensuring that the assembled villagers maintained proper order and displayed appropriate reactions to the proceedings. The execution was theatre designed to reinforce social hierarchy, and audience participation was mandatory. Villagers who failed to show sufficient horror at the criminal's fate or adequate gratitude for Sir Godwin's justice faced punishment for disrespecting feudal authority. The actual execution was mercifully quick, but the psychological impact lasted much longer. The farmer died with dignity, making no speeches or pleas for mercy, simply accepting his fate with the resignation of someone who had never expected justice from the system that was killing him. His death served no purpose beyond demonstrating that feudal lords could kill peasants with impunity, but it was presented as necessary for maintaining social order and protecting property rights. The crowd's reaction to the execution revealed their complete understanding of the message it was intended to convey. They were being shown what happened to people who challenged feudal authority, even in small ways like feeding their families through unauthorized hunting. The execution was a lesson in the futility of resistance and the inevitability of punishment for anyone who forgot their place in the social hierarchy. The afternoon brought your education in the military aspects of knighthood, which proved to be as pointless and destructive as the judicial and economic functions you had already observed. Sir Godwin had received reports of peasant unrest in the eastern settlements, which required investigation and appropriate response to prevent the unrest from spreading to other areas. The unrest turned out to be a group of farmers who had petitioned for reduced taxes during a year of crop failures. The petition was a carefully worded document that outlined the farmers' situation, with respectful language and reasonable requests for temporary tax relief. The farmers had followed proper procedures, submitted their petition through appropriate channels, and waited patiently for a response. Their behavior was entirely legal and completely respectful of feudal authority. Their only mistake was believing that the system might respond to their needs with some consideration for their welfare. Sir Godwin's response to this petition was to interpret it as evidence of dangerous revolutionary sentiment that required immediate suppression. In his analysis, any organized request for changed conditions represented a threat to social stability that had to be eliminated before it could inspire similar requests from other communities. The fact that the petition was reasonable and respectful made it more dangerous, not less, because reasonable requests were harder to dismiss than obviously unreasonable demands. The military operation to suppress this peasant unrest involved surrounding the village with armed men, arresting the petition organizers, and conducting interrogations to identify other potential troublemakers. The interrogations used techniques that were designed to extract information through pain and terror, rather than through rational inquiry. The goal was not to understand the farmers' grievances, but to identify everyone who might harbor similar grievances in the future. Your role in this military operation was to observe the interrogation techniques and learn how to identify signs of potential rebellion among peasant populations. Sir Godwin explained the importance of early intervention in preventing peasant unrest, the psychology of intimidation that kept rural populations compliant, and the administrative procedures for documenting suspected troublemakers for future reference. His instruction was thorough and professionally competent, but it was also training you to become an expert in domestic terrorism. The results of the interrogations revealed that the peasant unrest consisted entirely of people who were worried about feeding their families during a difficult economic period. They had no revolutionary agenda, no plans for violent resistance, and no political goals beyond survival. Their petition had been a desperate attempt to work within the system rather than outside it, but the system had interpreted their desperation as disloyalty that required punishment. The punishment phase of the operation involved public beatings for the petition organizers, increased tax assessments for the entire village, and the establishment of a permanent garrison to monitor future compliance. The peasants who had tried to work within the system discovered that the system punished cooperation as severely as it punished resistance. They learned that their only viable strategy was complete submission combined with silent endurance of whatever hardships the feudal system imposed on them. The evening brought reflection on the day's activities and preparation for tomorrow's similar activities. Sir Godwin reviewed the day's accomplishments with satisfaction, noting the successful rent collection, the deterrent effect of the execution, and the suppression of potential unrest before it could become a serious problem. From his perspective, the day had been professionally successful and had contributed to the maintenance of social order and feudal authority. Your own perspective on the day's activities was increasingly difficult to reconcile with any concept of honor, justice, or heroism. You had participated in armed robbery, witnessed a judicial murder, and helped suppress people whose only crime was asking for help during a time of need. Nothing you had done or observed bore any resemblance to the knightly ideals that had inspired you to pursue this career. You were training to become a professional criminal whose crimes happened to be legal. The cognitive dissonance between your expectations and reality was becoming unbearable. You had entered knightly service, believing that you would dedicate your life to protecting the innocent and upholding justice. Instead, you were learning to terrorize the innocent and pervert justice for the benefit of people who already had more wealth and power than they could possibly need. The gap between rhetoric and reality was so vast that it seemed to represent a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of medieval society. The conversations with other squires that evening revealed that your psychological crisis was neither unique nor unexpected. Everyone went through a similar process of disillusionment as they discovered the reality of knightly careers. The ones who survived this crisis were the ones who found ways to abandon their moral principles without completely destroying their sense of self-worth. The alternative was to leave knightly service, which meant abandoning years of training and disappointing family expectations. Thomas explained that moral principles were luxuries that interfered with professional effectiveness. He had learned to evaluate actions based on their practical consequences, rather than their ethical implications. This approach allowed him to participate in systematic oppression without experiencing guilt or self-doubt. His adaptation was psychologically successful but morally bankrupt, representing the complete triumph of expedience over principle. William described his strategy of psychological compartmentalization, which allowed him to separate his professional duties from his personal identity. He performed knightly functions without allowing them to define his character, maintaining a sense of moral self-worth while denying responsibility for actions that his position required him to take. This approach preserved his sanity, but also disconnected him from reality in ways that were increasingly obvious to outside observers. Geoffrey had embraced the role of villain, deciding that if knighthood required him to be evil, he would excel at evil, in the same way that other people excelled at virtue. His approach was perhaps the most honest, because it acknowledged the moral reality of knightly careers, without attempting to rationalize or compartmentalize the ethical implications. He had become an enthusiastic participant in systematic brutality, because he preferred clarity to self-deception. Your own psychological crisis was approaching a decision point where you would have to choose between moral principles and professional success. Continuing in knightly service required abandoning the ethical framework that had guided your previous decisions and adopting a new worldview that justifies systematic oppression as necessary for social order. The alternative was to abandon your career plans and find some other way to support yourself that didn't require participating in organized evil. The practical considerations that influenced this decision were substantial. Your family had invested years of resources in your knightly education and had expectations about your future that would be difficult to disappoint. Alternative careers were limited for someone with your social background and educational experience. Most importantly, leaving knightly service would require admitting that your understanding of the world had been fundamentally wrong, which was psychologically difficult for anyone to accept. The moral considerations were equally compelling, but operated in the opposite direction. Continuing in knightly service meant becoming complicit in systematic human suffering that served no beneficial purpose. It meant using your life to make the world worse rather than better, to increase rather than decrease the amount of injustice and cruelty in human society. It meant becoming the kind of person that your younger self would have despised and feared. The decision was further complicated by the recognition that individual withdrawal from the system wouldn't change the system itself. If you abandoned knightly service, someone else would take your place and perform the same functions with equal efficiency. Your moral stand would have no practical impact on the lives of the people who were being oppressed by the feudal system. It would be a gesture of personal integrity with no broader social significance. The realization that the system was larger than any individual participant was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that you weren't personally responsible for creating the conditions that made nightly brutality possible, but it also meant that you couldn't change those conditions through individual action. You were trapped in a system that was designed to perpetuate itself regardless of the moral qualms of its participants. The morning sun rose on another day of scheduled atrocities, and you faced the same choice that had confronted you yesterday and would confront you tomorrow. You could continue participating in systematic oppression while telling yourself that you were somehow different from other knights. Or you could find the courage to abandon a career that required you to abandon your humanity. The choice was between professional success and personal integrity, between social acceptance and moral clarity. The armor felt heavier that morning, not because it had gained weight, but because you finally understood what it represented. It was the uniform of an occupying army that had conquered its own population, the costume of actors in a theatrical performance designed to justify systematic theft and murder. Putting on that armor meant accepting a role in a production that celebrated everything you had once believed was evil. The choice you made that morning would determine not just your career but your character, not just your future but your soul. You could join the ranks of professional killers and systematic oppressors, or you could find the courage to walk away from everything you had planned for your life and start over with nothing but your moral principles intact. The decision was yours, but the consequences would last forever. 23 years of professional knighthood had taught Sir Aldrich the Grim that survival meant never thinking too carefully about what you had done to achieve it. But now that his sword arm was failing and his destrier was dying, the memories were flooding back with the persistence of blood seeping through bandages. Each scar on his body told a story he had tried to forget. Each dent in his armor marked a moment when someone had died instead of him. And each coin in his meager treasury represented wealth extracted from people who had needed it more than he did. The morning light streaming through the arrow slits of his crumbling tower revealed the accumulated debris of a knightly career that was finally grinding to its inevitable conclusion. His armor hung on its stand like the molted skin of some extinct predator, each piece bearing the marks of battles that had accomplished nothing except generating income for blacksmiths and grave diggers. His weapons rack displayed an arsenal of killing tools that had outlasted most of the men who had wielded them, implements of violence that would soon be passed on to the next generation of professional killers. The ledger on his table contained the financial summary of his military career, numbers that reduced decades of human suffering to simple arithmetic. He had participated in 37 major battles, 62 village raids, and countless individual acts of violence that had been too routine to document. The monetary returns from these activities had been sufficient to maintain his equipment and social status, but inadequate to provide security for his declining years. He faced the prospect of dying poor, despite having spent his entire adult life stealing from other people. His body was a catalogue of occupational injuries that told the story of medieval warfare with brutal honesty. The scar across his ribs marked the Battle of Crécy, where he had charged into a cloud of English arrows and survived only because his horse had been killed first, providing a barrier of horseflesh that had stopped the arrow meant for his chest. The limp in his left leg commemorated the siege of Calais, where he had fallen from a scaling ladder and shattered his ankle on stones slick with the blood of previous attackers. The tremor in his sword hand was a souvenir from the tournament at Reims, where he had taken a mace blow to the shoulder that had damaged nerves and muscle tissue in ways that no medieval physician could repair. The chronic cough that kept him awake at night was a legacy of the Italian campaign, where he had contracted some respiratory disease from sleeping in swamps and breathing the smoke from burning villages. His body was a museum of medieval military medicine, displaying the long-term consequences of treatments that had been designed to return wounded soldiers to combat rather than to promote actual healing. The mental toll of his career was harder to catalogue, but equally debilitating. He had killed so many people that he had stopped counting after the first 100, but he remembered faces from his early years when killing had still felt significant rather than routine. The farmer at Agincourt who had begged for mercy in broken French while Sir Aldrich drove a dagger through his throat. The merchant in Normandy who had tried to protect his daughter from soldiers who were there to collect taxes. The priest in Burgundy who had refused to reveal the location of church treasures and had been tortured to death for his stubborn integrity. These memories were accompanied by the faces of the people he had failed to save, comrades whose deaths he had witnessed without being able to prevent, and innocent victims whose suffering he had observed without being able to stop. The cumulative weight of this psychological burden had grown heavier with each passing year, Until now it felt like carrying a mountain of corpses on his shoulders. He had developed the 1,000-yard stare that marked veteran soldiers long before anyone had a name for the condition. The economic reality of his situation was as brutal as the physical and psychological damage. 23 years of military service had left him with enough money to maintain his lifestyle for perhaps 6 months. Assuming he could find buyers for his equipment and assuming that buyers would pay reasonable prices for weapons and armor that had been repaired too many times to be reliable. The feudal system that had employed his services had no pension plan, no retirement benefits, and no social safety net for aging knights who could no longer perform their duties. His horse was dying, which meant that his career was effectively over even if his body had been capable of continuing. Thunder had been his companion for 8 years, long enough to develop the kind of bond that only existed between soldiers who had faced death together repeatedly. The horse was suffering from some internal ailment that was beyond the capabilities of veterinary care, and each morning brought new evidence that his condition was deteriorating. Sir Aldrich faced the prospect of putting his only friend out of his misery, then walking to whatever future awaited him. The castle that had been his home for the past 5 years was another casualty of economic reality. The structure was falling apart from deferred maintenance, and Sir Aldrich lacked the resources to make the repairs that would keep it habitable through another winter. The roof leaked, the walls were crumbling, and the foundations were settling in ways that suggested eventual collapse. He would have to abandon his home and find alternative shelter before the building killed him. The isolation that had once seemed like a professional advantage was now a source of practical problems. Sir Aldrich had spent so many years focused on military activities that he had no civilian skills, no trade connections, and no social relationships that weren't based on violence or hierarchy. He was trained for warfare in a world that was increasingly finding alternative ways to resolve conflicts, leaving him with obsolete skills and outdated social connections. The younger knights who might have provided companionship and mutual support viewed Sir Aldrich as a relic from an earlier era whose experiences were no longer relevant to contemporary military realities. Warfare was becoming more professional, more technological, and more centralized, leaving little room for individual knights who operated according to older traditions. The feudal system that had created and sustained knightly careers was being replaced by more efficient forms of military organization. The reflection that occupied his thoughts during these final months of his career focused on the question of whether his life had served any useful purpose beyond enriching the merchants and craftsmen who had supplied his equipment. He had participated in wars that had accomplished nothing except changing which nobles collected taxes from which peasants. He had enforced laws that had protected the privileges of the wealthy while oppressing everyone else. He had maintained social order that had benefited the few at the expense of the many. The villages he had raided were still poor, still struggling, and still populated by people who viewed knights as natural enemies rather than protectors. The political conflicts he had participated in had been resolved temporarily through violence, but the underlying causes remained unchanged and would inevitably generate new conflicts that would require new violence. The social problems he had been hired to solve through force had been suppressed rather than solved, creating conditions that would eventually explode into more serious problems. His personal relationships had been destroyed or damaged by the demands of his career. He had never married because military service made family life impossible, and he had never maintained friendships with people outside the military because civilian society had no place for someone whose only skills involved killing and intimidation. The other knights he had served with were either dead, disabled, or scattered across Europe pursuing similar careers in different locations. The correspondence that occasionally reached his tower brought news of former comrades who had met various fates, typical of the knightly profession. Hugh de Morville had been killed at the Battle of Poitiers, not heroically in single combat, but anonymously in the chaos of a general retreat. Peter the Bold had died of dysentery during the siege of Bordeaux, another victim of the diseases that killed more knights than enemy weapons. Raymond of Toulouse had been executed for treason after backing the wrong claimant in a succession dispute. The survivors were in situations similar to his own, aging men with damaged bodies and obsolete skills, trying to find ways to support themselves in a world that no longer needed their services. Some had turned to banditry, using their military skills to steal from travelers and merchants who couldn't defend themselves. Others had become mercenaries, selling their services to whoever would pay them regardless of the cause they were fighting for. A few had entered monasteries, seeking spiritual comfort and material security in religious institutions that provided charity for retired soldiers. The alternative of joining a monastery had occurred to Sir Aldrich, but he doubted that any religious institution would accept someone with his history of violence and exploitation. His military career had involved systematic violation of religious principles, and his presence in a monastery would be a constant reminder of the church's complicity in the feudal system that had created knights. He was too stained by sin to find refuge in religious life, too old to start a new career, and too poor to retire comfortably. The irony of his situation was that he had achieved everything that knightly culture had taught him to value. He had survived longer than most of his contemporaries,